All right. Well, I get to talk to you about the exciting onboarding of new FDA approved products. And since it just says job title on here, I'll tell you that I am the administrative director for immune effector cell and gene therapy here at City of Hope. And what we're going to talk about today is organizational support for onboarding these new products, timelines to create, key stakeholders to have involved in the process, and then a checklist that actually was partially left over from a previous person in this position that I took over and then made my own. So in talking about organizational support, most all of the products I've onboarded have been prior to FDA approval. And so I am going to try and speak about doing this from a perspective of not having a lot of products that you've onboarded, as well as you potentially already have a program in place that you are moving forward with bringing on new products, because CAR-Ts have been around since 2017. So some institutions are pretty familiar with that. However, very recently, in the last 4 months, we've had gene therapies that have been FDA approved, as well as a new TIL product, and onboarding those are very different. So there are multiple companies and there are multiple products out there, and every single one of them brings with it additional work for a lot of different departments. And most organizations don't necessarily understand the workload that gets added to the people who are part of these programs. And so that's why I think that having organizational support for the programs is very, very important, as well as having goals for what you want to be known for and what you want to do clinically with the patients. Because if you're in a smaller institution, you may not be able to onboard every single CAR-T product out there and every manufacturer. Just one particular issue is the fact that they all have different portals and they don't all have single sign-on. So you have multiple departments that are having to log into 5, 6, 7 different manufacturing portals that all have different platforms, all have different perspectives of how you're going to do the care, both with your apheresis centers and your stem cell processing labs, your nurse coordinators, your infusion nurses, can all have to go into those systems, which can add a lot of extra work. So making sure that you have an executive sponsor. So this would be a decision maker that supports the initiative by removing barriers and addressing key areas that are needed for the successful onboarding of the product. Having a medical lead or a physician who is trained in IEC therapies or gene therapies to assist with the creation of processes and SOPs. Also, they can be a clinical decision maker. Making sure you have clear roles and expectations, identification of leads and the roles for each of those persons within the departments, resource allocation. As I mentioned, I think this is just something very important to always make sure there's conversations around that you have the resources that you need to be able to onboard these products, because they can be a very heavy lift depending on the organization that you're with. So what new resources are potentially going to be required? Which new ones will be given in order to onboard the product? And then you also need to consider FACT accreditation. What additional work will be needed for the product from a quality and accreditation standpoint as well? So this is just an example timeline of what you would want to create to do the onboarding process. This is one prior to FDA approval. So these are just some of the steps in the process. I started with organization approval, but really it starts, at least for my job, I look at BLA submissions. So when the biologics license application is approved, that is when they give the PDUFA date. And so that's usually when we start discussing whether or not we're going to onboard the product, whether or not it's something that, we have the patient population for, we have the physician support for, and the organizational support for. And once that BLA is approved, they can either do a regular PDUFA or an expedited. Expedited is 6 months. And then a regular one could be up to 12 months. And it does take that amount of time, or at least in my organization, it takes that amount of time to onboard the products. So cars are not as big of a deal these days since we've done so many of them. But the newer ones, when you have to create the whole entire program and you have to write brand new SOPs and get all of the training and the workflows in place, then that can be a lot more time consuming. So want to get organizational support, obviously. The evaluation and gap analysis, they do call these by different names depending on the manufacturer. Some of them do it, some of them don't. It just depends. But basically, it's where they come into your organization and they look at the workflows that you have or the departments that you have, and they make sure that you have everything in place to be successful with onboarding the product. Sometimes they'll be as in-depth as a FACT accreditation, where they want every single SOP that you have. They want every quality decision that you make. And then others are not quite as picky, but they will go through and decide, if there are certain things within your organization that they need additional proof that you do, or if there is any gaps within your processes that they want to see changes made. It's usually pretty quick and easy, not too in-depth. And as I said, some manufacturers do it, some don't. Then you would want to have workflow discussions. So any new processes or new workflows that would have to be done in different departments. They do have, different manuals for apheresis, for stem cell processing, for, potentially if you use nurse coordinators, we use CAR-T nurse coordinators, which we will have to change their name now because they are taking on TILs and potentially gene therapy as well. So you want to start those discussions. You want to create those algorithms. Then there's also IT security and portal approval. So depending on your organization, those could potentially be different, whether it's contracting or whether filling out forms. These entities are usually approved or covered entities for HIPAA. So you generally can have the MRN or PHI that's in their portals, but you do want to make sure that they interface with your IT system appropriately and make sure that security signs off on having them within the network, also having them be approved so they can get through the firewall. And then some manufacturers, the good ones, have single sign-on, which is fantastic because then your users can just log in with what their normal username and password is. Other ones do not, unfortunately. And so you do have to create a new username and password, which when there's 5 or 6, 7 different companies, that can be a little cumbersome for the staff. So you want to make sure you get that done. Obviously, you need to look at your SOPs, make sure that those are updated. What we do, because generally we're doing this prior to FDA approval, because our physicians usually want to use the product the moment that the FDA approves it. They want to have a patient in their office the next day and start treating them. And we usually have to let them know that they need to wait a little while because we don't know what the approval is going to say. And so when you write them, if you're doing it prior to that PDUFA date and that approval, you do have to make sure that they're in draft form because they might not approve it the way the clinical trial was done. They might add things in, they might take things out. So you don't necessarily know for sure exactly what's going to be on there. So making sure that everything's in draft is very important. But by doing so, you can make sure that you are ready when it is approved, at least to the best of your ability. So then there's contracting. This is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine where the manufacturers all have different names for their contracts. Some have master service agreements, some have trade agreements, some have statements of work. They're all sort of different. And so you have to make sure that you get all of the contracting done, going through both legal, insurance reviewers, your obviously contracting department, your quality department, making sure that's all done. Then there are the pieces of the treatment plan, depending on your electronic medical record. You want to make sure you have like admission order sets and treatment plans and those things. And there I was smart because I put draft. So once again, it has to be draft if it's not FDA approved. And then hopefully you get FDA approval, and then you can start your training. And I went through this whole thing, and I was going to wait until I actually got to my checklist. But I get so excited about my timeline. So we're going to cruise through it later on. Anyway, so training, sometimes you can do training before FDA approval. Sometimes you can't. It depends on what the training is. So you do have to have a time set up for what that training looks like. There's usually portal training that's by the manufacturer. There are manuals that you have to do training with for your stem cell processing lab and your apheresis, your nurses who infuse the products. And then also you would have your site-specific education and training that you would do with your staff for your specific workflows. For how it's going to work within your institution. And then depending on the product, you usually do a dry run so that you can make sure prior to the first patient, you have every part of the process in place and that it's smooth, and you can identify if there are any gaps or any issues with getting the product, collecting the product, getting the product, or infusing the product. All right, so now key stakeholders. We're going to back up a little bit. Key stakeholders can be department chairs for whichever departments are involved in these therapies. Contracting needs to be involved due to the master service agreements. Legal obviously needs to look over most of that since they are legal binding contracts. Your clinicians, such as your physicians, your APPs, your nurses. The different departments that are included are apheresis, stem cell processing lab, pharmacy. For the TIL product, the OR is involved specifically with procuring the tumor, but they can also be involved with line placement, research, quality, nursing, both inpatient and outpatient, depending on how you plan on giving the products. And then, of course, nurse coordinators or whoever is assigned to care for the patient with their pre-workup, their apheresis, and collection. So managed care and payers also need to be involved, especially with the newer products, making sure that you have discussions with whether or not they're going to cover the product, making sure they, if you're a center of excellence, that they will. And then most of them end up having to have a letter of agreement due to the fact that they are new and not necessarily covered and haven't figured out all the contracting with them. So business and finance department needs to be involved, especially as you've heard previously, some of these therapies are multi-million-dollar therapies. And so you need to make sure that it's going to be financially viable to have them. And then third-party specialty pharmacies, most of these products go through the specialty pharmacy, such as Cardinal or McKesson, for the purchasing and the POs. So here's my checklist. So this is the stages of onboarding a product. You have site qualification, the MSA and quality agreement review and negotiations, site activation, then organizational logistics, and treatment initiation. And then this is just spelled out as far as all of the specific sections of things that you need or that you want to do in order to complete this. So site qualification, you have to have a designated on-site CAR-T clinical program director, a designated CAR-T quality coordinator, and then for any of the products that are REMS, which is the risk evaluation mitigation. I should know this in my sleep, but anyway, REMS, you have to have an authorized representative, which all of the CAR products do have a REMS program associated with it. And so You do have to make sure that anyone who prescribes, dispenses, or infuses products has been REMS trained. They do quarterly audits, they do annual audits, and making sure that that's occurring. And so that person has to oversee that whole process, which is also when you talk about resources that are needed, the fact that somebody has to oversee that and be watching and making sure that everyone's getting the training that needs it. It's a very cumbersome and time-consuming thing, and every manufacturer has a different learning management system that you have to get into to verify that those people that have been designated as prescribers, dispensers, and infusers have been trained. So then there's the contracts. The CDA is the first, then your master service agreement, your quality or apheresis agreement, any trade agreements that might be there, enrollment scheduling and order flow requirements. So patient enrollment, order flow training, obviously chain of custody and chain of identity is extremely important. And then setting up the specialty distributor. So once again, more of the tasks that are just specified out here of what you want to do to make sure that you have everything in place prior to onboarding the product and or FDA approval. So have the goal completion date, the status, the actual completion date of when it occurred, because these are not things that happen, within a week or two. So you're usually having to track it over a matter of weeks or months. Site activation. So once you've completed preparation training and updated your SOPs, infusion training and updated SOPs, also with the REMS program, and with any quality program, you want to make sure that any adverse events, that you have management training, that you have updated SOPs on how you'll report those. One thing is that you have usually the option to report these either through the manufacturer or through the FDA. So we report through MedWatch, and we have a very specific algorithm that we go through for our adverse events. And then we report them all through the FDA through MedWatch so that they can make sure that there aren't any negative consequences occurring consistently for these patients. And there have been some interesting ones that we have found. So anyway, finalizing the master service agreement, making sure you have REMS certification, which is making sure all your staff are trained, the Epic order sets, the operation manuals, and then for organizational logistics, making sure everyone has clear expectation on roles and responsibilities, the nurse coordinator workflow, your AR workflow, your quality workflow, charge capture, marketing and communications usually wants to be involved if it's a new FDA approved product, especially with things like the TIL and gene therapy recently, because these are new to the market and not something that have been offered before. They want to make sure, new patient services know that we're offering it, that we have, because the manufacturers will put your name on their website to show that you are offering this product, and then people will call you. And so you want to make sure that your new patient services know that you're offering the product and what the steps are for seeing the physicians for it as well. So, all right. As a review, we discussed organizational support, talked about the timeline, our key stakeholders that we want to have involved, and then went over that fantastic checklist. And that actually ends my presentation. So